Okay, today I'm delighted to be joined by my good friend Fiona Harvey, who is environment editor at The Guardian, or to give her a proper title, a multi-award winning environment editor at The Guardian. But great to have you on the podcast, Fiona.
Oh, it's lovely to be here, Griff. Thanks very much for having me on.
Right, as we speak, you're just back from the Labour Party conference, which is their first since their big win in the UK general election in July. So how did you find the conference?
It was absolutely fascinating. It was a great few days up in Liverpool. People were generally very upbeat. The delegates, I think, were more upbeat than the leadership in many ways.
Yeah.
And, you know, there was an awful lot that people were discussing in terms of, new Labour policies and, the party's actions so far in government and what we're still expecting. And the environment played a very big role. I would say that, people were very enthusiastic. Environmental issues, all the environment sessions were very well attended that I saw. There were, appearances from the main cabinet ministers, Ed Miliband and Steve Reid, looking at this area. And also there were a lot of other issues that will be affected by the net zero target and so on. So there was an awful lot of discussion around them. People were discussing everything from, the sewage in the rivers to the new housing, 1.5 million homes that Labour's going to build, to the net zero target and Great British Energy and net zero jobs. So, yeah, all round, it was very busy and an awful lot of work happening.
Yeah, well, Ed Miliband in particular seems to be living his best life. He kind of reminds me of a spaniel that's been cooped up in the house all day and then has been let out into the garden. He's running around with great enthusiasm. I suppose one of the interesting things, because I watched some of the speeches from afar, was that last week at the Trade Union Congress, there was a couple of shots fired across his bows by the unions, particularly about potential job losses in North Sea oil and gas, and the transfer from coke burning, blast furnace steelmaking to electric arc furnaces. Did any of that come through at the conference itself?
Yeah, well, these are really difficult issues, and we had last year Keir Starmer made some big speeches about, Great British Energy and what they were going to do with that. And he was very careful to do that up in Scotland, and to talk about the transition for North Sea oil workers and to assure those workers that they still had a future. So, this is a very delicate issue for Labour. And I think everybody is very conscious that there has to be a just transition here. You can't just kind of abandon North Sea oil and gas workers in the way that coal miners were abandoned by Margaret Thatcher. You have to be honest about this. There isn't a long-term future in North Sea oil and gas, but there wasn't going to be anyway. Because the North Sea oil and gas fields are very depleted. They've been going away for 50 odd years, and that depletion is going to continue whether we have a net zero target or not. And in fact, the difference between the amount that you'll get out of the North Sea under a net zero target and the difference that you would get out and the amount you would get out if we didn't have such a target is actually marginal, really, in many ways. Really, that needs to be addressed. And what Labour needs to do is to fill out the details of its plan for addressing that, fill out the details of this just transition. Starmer started on that because he started talking about the Great British Energy, publicly owned renewable energy company that's going to be set up in Aberdeen, headquartered up there in Scotland. And so we're starting to get some flesh on those bones now. But they'll need to put an awful lot more detail out before we know, what's going to happen to workers, how people are going to be reskilled and retrained, how you kind of, phase out North Sea oil and gas and phase in more and more offshore wind, onshore wind, other forms of renewable energy, potentially nuclear, and so on.
Yeah. Well, Ed Miliband definitely made a section of his speech where he was sort of calling on the unions to join the green tech revolution and embrace it. And I suppose Keir Starmer announcing it was really a re-announcement of the Aberdeen base for GB Energy, I assume was part of that that sort of narrative to the unions to try and take part.
I think this has been very hard for a lot of unions, partly because we do have that experience of what happened to coal a generation ago, and also because those jobs currently are heavily unionised, and the jobs that are coming in renewable energy have not necessarily been so up to now.
Yeah.
So there's a natural inclination for people to want to hold on to what they've got, but you can't hold on to something that's disappearing anyway.
Yeah.
So you've got to face up to this, and I think that unions could be a really important part of the just transition. They could be a really important part of a net zero future, but they do have to face up to the realities of that, and they will have to make some difficult choices.
Yeah. Before most of the speeches that I listened to, whether it was Chancellor Rachel Reeves, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, or Ed Miliband, the Net Zero Secretary, were focused on this clean power target. But before the conference, you wrote an article with 6 cross-government areas that you felt the government had to start looking at as well, outside that narrow focus. And I'm paraphrasing them as transport, housing, the electricity grid, self-farming, meeting the carbon budgets, and the Treasury rules. Did you feel that at conference that some of these areas were fleshed out in the way that you suggested they needed to be?
No. We still have no plan for how we are going to get to the massive reduction in emissions that we need from transport.
Yeah.
The plans for 1.5 million new homes need to be fully low carbon, and we don't have that plan yet. The existing homes need to be brought up to good standards of insulation. We got something on that from Ed Miliband. He made an announcement that all rented homes will have to be at least band C in terms of energy efficiency by 2030. That includes socially rented homes as well as privately rented homes. So, that's a good start, but it's, not enough yet. About a fifth of the UK's emissions come from homes. So, we need a lot more action there. Farming, we heard very little about how we're going to get to net zero from farming, and farming and food more generally. There wasn't really very much on this kind of overarching plan that we need, that they need to have. I think they need to have it by next May for the High Court, which is a kind of national plan for how we meet our net zero targets, because the one that the Tories had got thrown out by the courts. There's an awful lot that's still to do. Emissions from transport are still stubbornly high. They really haven't come down much in the last decade. And we need, a proper plan for transport. We've seen Louise Haigh on a bike. That's it. That's not a plan. We need her to do a great deal more to explain how we will boost public transport in this country. Renationalising the rail services and improving bus services by putting them back in local control. Those are good first steps, but that's it. They're just first steps. We need a comprehensive plan on transport.
Yeah. Well, I suppose you could argue that a government that's only been in power for 3 months is these will be works in progress. But yes, I would fully agree. I think
you have to cut them some slack. But on the other hand, we've got some decisions which are coming up already or have been made already. For instance, on airport expansion, and Rachel Reeves has been talking very positively about airport expansion as a sort of tool of economic progress. But if you're going to expand airports, you're going to get an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and you're going to need to make massive cuts elsewhere. So where are those cuts in gas emissions going to come from?
Yeah,
we haven't got the answer to that yet. So the whole question of airport expansion is a really tricky one that they haven't grappled with yet. And you can't just say, on the one hand, we're going to meet our net zero targets. On the other, we're going to expand all these airports because we want them for the economy. Those two things are incompatible, and at some point, you have to reconcile them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so plenty to be getting their teeth into, or plenty on the agenda. But I was mulling this myself as whether, in terms of public perception and, big speech, whether the green power thing is whether it represents a narrowness of thinking, or whether it's just a sort of almost rhetorical device to hang a lot of this stuff on. But yes, I would fully agree with that. And then you also got an announcement about a new appointment by the government as climate envoy.
Yeah, we broke the news last week that the government is going to appoint a new climate envoy. And for the first time, a nature envoy. Now, the post of climate envoy has been around for a long time, but it was axed by Rishi Sunak very controversially last year, which people were very unhappy about. And so having a new one is a really important step in terms of putting the UK forward in international climate diplomacy. So we were able to break the story that the new climate envoy will be Rachel Kite. She is very well known in climate circles. She was climate chief in the World Bank for many years. She went on to be chief executive of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. Then she went off to be the dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University in America. And more recently, she has been and still is a professor of practice in politics at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford. So she has got a sort of portfolio career at the moment, lots of different things, advising lots of different people, sitting on boards and so on. What she will do as climate envoy is she will spearhead the government's attempts to forge new alliances with developed and developing countries around the world with a view to getting greater ambition on the climate.
Is this part of David Lammy's, the Foreign Secretary, I should say, David Lammy's speech about international climate leadership?
Yeah. So he made a speech last week at Kew Gardens. It was a very good speech. It reminded me a great deal of John Kerry, who also took to Kew Gardens to make a big intervention on the climate back in 2021 ahead of COP26. So I think he was very consciously following in John Kerry's footsteps. And yeah, it was David Lammy setting out his stall for why the UK would be a global leader on the climate. And what was really notable there from him and from Ed Miliband, who's also done some interesting things on this recently, and Steve Reed as well, who made a speech at the Natural History Museum last week too. What's notable from all three of them is this bold, unapologetic tone for saying it's important for the UK to be a leader in these areas. And why is that significant? Well, because the last government was saying the opposite, essentially. This opposite narrative got entrenched under Rishi Sunak, which was that leading on net zero is bad. It puts a burden on people, puts a burden on the economy. It puts costs on families. It's a really bad thing. Instead of being a leader, we will be a laggard. That will be better for people.
Yeah.
This is, of course, not true because actually, if we are going to have a livable planet, then we all need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and very fast.
Yeah.
So there's no benefit to anyone in being a laggard on this. You also miss out on the economic opportunities of shifting to a low carbon economy. Shifting to a low carbon economy is essential if we are actually going to be able to stay alive.
Yeah.
So, avoiding something that is essential is not really a sensible long-term economic tactic for anyone. But that was the entrenched narrative under Rishi Sunak. So this is a massive change, really. This is a total change for the UK government. And I think a lot of our allies on the world stage will be really, really pleased that the government is coming out and saying this at last. Yeah. I think they will be delighted that the UK is back, that the UK is making a positive case, and that the UK is prepared to lead.
Yes. And how do you think that leadership, did you get any idea of how that leadership might manifest itself in practice?
So another big question for the UK, of course, is about the future of climate finance, because in 2021, ahead of the COP29 summit that was in Glasgow, Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister at the time, of course, he set out a target of 11.6 billion in climate finance from the UK going to developing countries over the following 5 to 6 years. So that target is still active because it runs to 2026. But Boris Johnson's government and Rishi Sunak's government underspent on that target. They didn't spend the amount each year in climate finance that you need to in order to have spent 11.6 billion over 6 years. Whether they did that deliberately or not, who knows? But the upshot of that is that if Labour is going to fulfil that target, then they will have to spend a great deal more than the Tories did. So it's put Labour in a difficult position. And, the thing is that if you're going to try and be a leader on the international stage, or even just if you're going to have any credibility, you do have to fulfil your commitments. And yes, that was a commitment made by a previous Tory government. But if you're a poor country looking for climate finance, you're going to be very, very disappointed if Labour doesn't actually fulfil that commitment. So, yeah, it will be more expensive for them to do so than it should have been, because the Tories have left a black hole in this form of finance as well. But what are you going to do? If you want to be a world leader in this, and if you want to be seen as a country that fulfills its promises, then I think you have to honour that commitment.
Yes, a broken promise from Boris Johnson. Who would have thunk it?
Exactly. But it's a really good time for the UK to step up, because if you look at what's happening internationally, the US is in the throes of, the most extraordinary presidential election that there's been in my lifetime, that could have devastating consequences for the planet if Donald Trump follows through on the blueprint that we've seen, that his advisors are planning, which would lay waste to all kinds of environmental protections across the US, and would raise greenhouse gases from the US enormously. So, the future of the US in terms of climate talks is hanging in the balance at the moment. Yeah. Then if you look across Europe, President Macron has been a leader on the climate, so has Olaf Scholz of Germany. But both of them are facing great difficulties at home. Some of them arguably of their own making, some of them to do with, headwinds that are affecting everyone around the world. So neither of those are really stepping up to the extent that we've seen them in the past. Similarly, the European Commission has just appointed some great environmental champions, Teresa Ribera former Environment Minister of Spain, and Dan Jorgensen, the Climate Minister from Denmark. They're both now European commissioners. They're really strong climate advocates. Both of them have a fantastic track record. So that's really positive. That's really strong. But, we've seen the European Parliament elections. We've seen this sort of backlash against climate and environmental action in Europe. So it's a tricky time for Europe. And then if you look more broadly across the world, Justin Trudeau has been a climate champion. He's in trouble. There's in Canada. Japan, used to be a climate leader a long time ago. We see very little from them now. China, not really quite sure where China is going on this at the moment. India, Narendra Modi tries to ignore the climate, even though it's killing people across his country. There aren't that many countries who are really stepping up and taking leadership at the moment. So for the UK to do so is really important.
But perhaps now we're talking about the sort of international issues. We've got COP29, the conference parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Azerbaijan in November. And I think you must have attended more COPs than anybody else I know. When was your first one?
2004.
So which COP was that?
That was in Buenos Aires.
Right. And, I sort of look at these things from a little distance. I don't dig into them. I've never tried to attend one of them, never mind attending them. But received wisdom is that COP15 in Copenhagen was the sort of low point of the process, and the COP21 Paris was the high ground. Would you agree with that view?
No, I wouldn't agree with that at all. The COP in Copenhagen was dreadful in many ways because it sort of descended into chaos. However, we did get an agreement there. People forget this. Yeah. There was an agreement there that wasn't ratified by the COP, but was ratified the following year. But it was agreed by the countries, and it stood. It was fulfilled. It was the first time that developed and developing countries had both together taken on targets on reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, or in the case of developing countries, curbing the future growth of their greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. So it was actually a really important step forward in terms of international climate diplomacy, and a lot was achieved there. It was just obscured by the terrible optics.
Yeah. And you upset a few people after Copenhagen for criticising NGOs' behaviour?
They behaved really badly. Some NGOs, not all, some NGOs behaved extraordinarily badly at Copenhagen. They behaved with culpable naivety.
Yeah. A good phrase, very, very laden. Are you talking to them again now? Are you, because obviously they reacted quite. Now. Sorry?
They have different personnel now.
Oh, right.
I remain.
Well, I sometimes wonder about those things, because sometimes when you speak truths to people like that, they react very badly, but then they quietly change their behaviour afterwards. So do you feel they take a more productive stance at COP and other climate events now?
I hope that people have grown up a bit. Unfortunately, there's still naivety in many quarters, and there are also people who play what should I say? Unfortunately, there are some people who don't appreciate the full complexity of international relations on the climate. Yeah. And it's really important to look at who is trying to play whom, you know. So, for instance, China rarely comes out directly to kind of, block things that it doesn't like, but will employ other countries to do that for them. There are other blockers, the Saudi Arabia, of course, but it never does so publicly, or rarely does so publicly. There are many sort of oil-producing countries who try to put a brake on things, but also masquerade as poor little developing countries who are in desperate need of help.
Yes. I suppose
So
when your entire economy is predicated on fossil fuels, it's pretty hard to go, well, okay, we're going to give it all up. A lot of those states would, some of them might make it in tourism, but their economies are so based on fossil fuels, it's going to be very difficult for them.
Well, for some of them, it would be a lot easier if they weren't repulsive dictatorships.
Yeah, very true. Do you think that, this is the second year in a row the meeting's been hosted in a petrostate? Do you think that makes a difference?
Well, is it just the second in a row? There's been a lot of petrostates who have hosted a COP, from Canada and the UK to the UAE and Azerbaijan, and indeed Brazil next year, has large oil and gas operations. So yes, Azerbaijan is far more dependent on oil and gas than most other countries, but it certainly isn't unique in being an oil and gas producer that is hosting COP. Azerbaijan is extraordinarily dependent on fossil fuels. When I went there in May, it was very striking. As soon as you stepped off the plane, you could smell the oil. Mm-hmm. And I went into downtown Baku, the capital, and there were these kind of, those old nodding donkey oil wells. Yeah, wonderful to look at. They're right there in the center of the city. Looking very dashing, in fact, and all this kind of green and red paint. But yeah, that shows quite how embedded oil is in that country. It's the world's first petrostate, really. They started drilling for oil there in the 1840s. It was the Alfred Nobel's brothers, who kind of exploited it first. And they have there's a great deal of national pride attached to oil and gas there. They take a lot of credit for helping to win the Second World War, because they produced the oil and gas that Russia used, the oil mainly, that fueled Russia's army and war machine in the Second World War. So it's a matter of national identity, as well as anything else.
But I sometimes struggle with why one of these states would want to host the meetings, because it's sort of holding a mirror up to some harsh realities, or do they think they'll be, a sort of greenwashing or cop washing is going on, that they want to be seen to say the right thing while they keep pumping oil and gas?
We can all speculate on the reasons. But Azerbaijan didn't have a net zero target. It doesn't have, in fact, currently. But presumably it will by the time we get to COP, because they are working on a new nationally determined contribution. And so, it would be very odd if that didn't have a net zero target.
Yeah. So it maybe push them along a little bit. So what are the big issues on the agenda for this year?
So the most difficult thing that is going to be discussed at COP is the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal. And what that means is a global target on climate finance. That's the finance that needs to go to the developing world to help those countries to cut their greenhouse gas emissions and to cope with the impacts of the climate crisis. And so that NCQG will be the one thing that we really need to come out of this COP. And it's in trouble, because the developing countries want about, roughly speaking, $1 trillion a year. And the developed countries are talking about sums that are, somewhere around sort of 500-600 billion a year. The current target, of course, is 100 billion a year. Now, that was set at the Copenhagen climate COP, that COP that everybody hates, but that lots of things came from. So that $100 billion a year was supposed to flow to developing countries from 2020. Now, that target was slightly missed. It's being hit now, but it wasn't hit in 2020 or 2021. It was hit in 2022, probably, and certainly in 2023. So the developed countries were a little bit late with that. But there we go, we've got it now. Now, the process by which that figure of 100 billion was reached in Copenhagen was a very simple process. It was just dreamt up by Hillary Clinton, essentially. And then announced, and everyone agreed with it. This is the first time, therefore, that there has been a real process to come up with a number, a real number that has some kind of academic basis, some kind of basis in fact. And it was Nick Stern and Vera Sonway, the climate economist, who came up with the kind of what's the gold standard really on research on this. They published it they published it before the Dubai COP, actually. They published it at the COP in Egypt. And it's the goal that they said, slightly complicated. They said you need about 2.4 trillion a year for developing countries who are not China to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and cope with the impacts of the climate crisis. But most of that money would be likely to come from those countries' own existing national budgets, because they need to develop. And what you do is you develop in a clean way. You build wind farms and solar farms instead of building coal-fired power plants, that kind of thing. So a lot of it would come from those countries themselves, and you would need somewhere above $1 trillion a year to come from international sources such as the World Bank and other multilateral development banks, and finance from developed countries, and so on. So those are the kind of figures that we're talking about. And some of the developing countries and developing country groups have submitted their demands for what they want as the NCQG. And roughly $1 trillion. I mean, some of it's 1.4 trillion. There are a variety of numbers out there, but if we talk about $1 trillion, that's in the right ballpark. And that's a really hard number to get to from 100 billion. So what you will need to do is that there are several things you'll need to do. One is to have innovative forms of finance. You'd like to have some new sources. So that could be things like windfall taxes on fossil fuels. It could be things like a levy on frequent flyers. It could be a levy on shipping. Could be a wealth tax. Brazil wants to see a tax on billionaires. It would be a tiny fraction of what billionaires make, like something like 2%. And it would only affect something like 100 families around the world. And yet it would raise, I forgot the figure, but something like 200 billion or whatever a year. So it would take you quite a big way towards the target. But Brazil doesn't want all of that to go to climate finance, but some of it would. So there are all these ideas out there. There's also going on parallel to this, there are efforts to reform the World Bank, and that would free up a lot of cash to come to climate finance. If you recapitalize the World Bank, which wouldn't cost an enormous amount to developed countries, but would really help, and then the World Bank and the IMF could do a lot more in terms of devoting money to climate finance. Also, developed countries will need to pledge more. That's that's another thing that will need to happen. And what developed countries are saying at the moment is that you need to expand the donor base. So you need money from big countries that have big economies that are not currently donors. And, oh, we're looking at you, petrostates. Because you had the COP in Dubai last year, and the United Arab Emirates qualifies as a developing country, and yet no one could visit Dubai and think these people don't have money.
Yes, absolutely. So
similarly, Saudi Arabia, if Saudi Arabia can spend all that money on football players and golf players, you'd think that they could spare some for the victims of their greenhouse gas industries.
Yes.
So you really have to look at petrostates here, but you also have to look at China. And let's not forget that an awful lot of developing countries are suffering under mountains of debt. A huge amount of those debt repayments are going to China.
Yes.
So, China is actually adding to the problem here rather than solving it. So, there's an awful lot going on here. You can't just lay all of this at the door of the developed countries.
Yeah.
Yes, they have to bear a huge amount of the responsibility. But you can't just say it's all down to them. That's willful ignorance.
Yeah. I was thinking, because on the developed countries as well, you were talking about the sort of populist movements that lots of pro climate action leaders are facing. And that kind of makes being seen to be passing money overseas more difficult, doesn't it? That it's, you can imagine the Nigel Farages of this world kicking up a stink. Why are we giving all this money to, build wind turbines in Southeast Asia or Africa, or solar panels, whatever it might be? So I suppose that's a complication, but one that maybe the petrostates and China don't face.
The thing that Nigel Farage and his supporters need to explain to us is what they're going to do about the climate crisis, when the climate crisis is going to bring disaster to people around the world. It's going to cause people to have to leave their homes and try to move to other places where you can still live. It's going to massively affect people in this country and the wealth of this country, when we're constantly having to mop up after floods, or we're having to import more food because of droughts, or we're having to repair our infrastructure because it's being destroyed by the extreme weather that we're going to face. How are you going to cope with all of that if you're going to deny net zero, deny the climate crisis, and pretend that it doesn't exist?
Well, we know what the answer is to that question, which is they won't bother answering the question. They'll wave it off, because that's what populism has never been about. Reasoned arguments.
Well, hopefully voters will be able to see through that, because if you can't answer those questions, you don't deserve to be anywhere near government.
Yes.
As an MP or as any kind of influential person. It's a disgrace, actually, to just shy away from those questions. These are the questions that are going to become more and more pressing as we go on into the climate crisis, as climate breakdown worsens. And if you want to be a leader in this country, then you must answer those questions.
Yeah. And what are they? You said this getting this financial agreement was going to be difficult. Are there any other big issues on the COP agenda for Azerbaijan?
Well, that's the main issue for COP29, but we also have looming next year COP30. And ahead of that, in February, there's a deadline for under the Paris Agreement for all countries to come up with new NDCs. Now, NDCs mean nationally determined contributions. They're basically national climate plans for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. The first NDCs were produced in 2015 at Paris, but new ones are needed, and they have to be aligned with the goal of holding global temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is the one that we're all signed up to. So all countries need to revise their NDCs so that their targets are in line with that. We will see, who comes out with NDCs early at COP29, because we think that some countries are hoping to. Azerbaijan, the host of COP29, is supposed to be coming out with its NDC. Ed Miliband is working on an NDC for the UK, which could be published, at least in part, at COP29. Similarly, Brazil is working on an NDC now, and they want to publish that early, hopefully at COP29. So there are a few countries that are trying to come up with this early to try and spur things along. But of course, we have the US election, and that's going to take place just a few days before COP29. So, we could be, we don't know what's going to happen.
Yes.
We could have Donald Trump, who, would withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement again and destroy everything that Joe Biden has achieved on the climate. We could have, Kamala Harris, and, she obviously would take a very different line on the climate, but we're not entirely sure what she would say. And we could have some kind of limbo, like we saw last time with, we don't know.
Disputed elections, yes. I've taken up a huge amount of your time. This has been absolutely fantastic looking at this all, but I suppose one final question is, from all your experience, whether nationally or internationally, are you optimistic or pessimistic for the future?
I'm always optimistic, because really you can't be anything else. It's a massive peril that we are facing. But there has been huge progress in the last 20 years that I've been covering this. We've seen the price of renewable energy come down massively. We've seen the take-up of solar and wind increase enormously. We've seen awareness around the world increase enormously. We've seen governments really get to grips with this. We've seen huge changes that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. And yet they're happening, and they're happening at pace. So, we have an awful lot to play for, and what is the choice? You can't just sit there and let this happen.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I hope you're right, because I tend to cleave to the same view. You've got to be optimistic. You've got to keep going. I don't like climate doomism. I think it's almost as dangerous as climate denial, but that's my sermon. Anyway, thank you for taking the time and to tell us, because I think whether about UK national policy and how it's formulating, or the insights into the sometimes slightly opaque COP process, that was brilliant, and we look forward to reading your reports from Azerbaijan as they appear.
Yeah, well, it should be really interesting, actually. Yeah. And we do a live blog every day from the COP for The Guardian, with some lighter moments as well. We do things like, who's the best dressed person at COP? So yeah.
Who tends to top that poll? Here's the question. Who tends to top that poll? Because we have been quite serious so far in the discussion. So just before you go, is there any particular country tends to have the best?
Well, there's always, the indigenous people from the Amazon always put on a fantastic show. They come with their beautiful dress and so on. So they are hard to beat. But of course, you get people from the Pacific Islands, so on. Again, wonderful national dress. And then sometimes there's an awful lot of middle-aged men in grey suits. But occasionally, some of them will break out and do something unusual. So we can see whether that happens this year. Looking at you, Ed Miliband.
So if you're going to be betting on best dressed person at COP29, there's Fiona's tips. But thank you very much for tonight.
Been a pleasure, Griff. It's lovely to see you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
cheers.